begin by thanking my friend Ranjit and BCIS for inviting me to be here this morning to make the opening address on this very important subject, Sri Lanka-China relations. Just a few months ago, we invited some of the leading economists of the world to discuss the Sri Lanka economy and prospects for growth. One common subject that all these economists referred to was the very favorable relationships that we had with three countries in Asia. These countries are India, China and Japan. This trilateral relationship is very crucial for Sri Lanka's future growth. Today we are discussing our relationships with China, appropriately so because on the 6th delegation led by the Prime Minister will be visiting China, and hopefully we will be opening a new chapter in the long association between our two countries. I would suggest that the BCIS should then also have similar seminars on our relationships with India, as you have just mentioned, and also with Japan. Sri Lanka's relationship, I would say the early relationship with China, is marked by three major events. The first was that after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, was one of the first countries to recognize the new republic. I think we were among the first 10 countries to make that decision. Many of us have worked in international organizations, and we know how much legitimacy is important for member states. At that time, China naturally was very interested in establishing her legitimacy as the representative, the true representative of the Chinese people. It was under dispute. For many years, particularly the United States led a concerted attempt to deprive China of that right, a seat in the Security Council, recognition of Taiwan, and a whole series of activities which made the question of recognition and legitimacy a very important element for the new republic. And Sri Lanka's gesture in being an early friend of China, the new China, I think has to be recorded and is well appreciated in China. Then the number two event is the China-Ceylon Rice Rubber Pact. That also was in the face of opposition from the United States. We had to pay a price for it in the sense of being deprived of PL 480 and all that. But nevertheless, it was a singular act of political courage. In spite of all those pressures, in spite of a divided cabinet, I must say, Sri Lanka went ahead and signed that agreement at a time when rubber was recognized by the United States Congress as a strategic material. All those prohibitions came because rubber was recognized as a strategic material at that time. Then the third, I believe, was the setting up of our mutual relationships leading to the establishment of embassies. We established an embassy in Beijing, and the Chinese government established its mission in Colombo. Subsequently, of course, there was Madam Sirimao Bandaranaike's mediation efforts. So these are milestones in our relationship with China, which is well recognized. If we come to modern times, I don't want to go through this whole narrative of the flip-flops of Chinese policy. We will begin with, I think, the crucial element that was called the four modernizations that was enunciated by Premier Zhou Enlai. That was the last throw of the dice as far as he was concerned. He was, as the new information and the new writings make clear, he was under great pressure, he was under threat, politically, physically he was very weak, and this was his major contribution. When to the Congress he made the suggestion that China should break with the past and go for the four modernizations. It was following the very sad experiences of the Cultural Revolution. In Sri Lanka, it was, I think, wrongly misinterpreted as something to do with culture. It did not have very much to do with it. It did have something to do with culture, but it was not all about the Peking opera, though that also was part of this grand history of the Cultural Revolution. But what was crucial was that the notion that ideology must prevail over politics, ideology must prevail over economics, which was the central thinking of Mao Zedong, which led to the worst famine ever recorded in the history of man. The Chinese famine following the Cultural Revolution, which is still not acknowledged. I would refer you to the writings of Amartya Sen, where he says very clearly, that's his thesis, that because of the absence of a democratic process, that famines occur, not because there is no food. Always there is enough food, but the individual entitlement is not met. The Great Bengal famine came at a time when there was excess of grain in Bengal. But fearing the repercussions of the war, the merchants started hoarding grain, and what Amartya Sen calls the individual's allotment of nourishment and food was not made available. Similarly in China. But now Amartya Sen's argument is that in democratic countries, the media and political organizations, social organizations kick up such a row that it is no longer possible to prevent the distribution of that grain or food and ensuring that that individual allotment is made available to everyone. But in Mao Zedong's communist China, that democratic process was not working. As a result, unreported, one of the biggest famines in the history of man went on in China. That led to serious rethinking. That is to a great tribute to the leaders of the Communist Party, that there was an internal discussion, there was acrimonious discussion, but finally the modernists led by Mao Zedong, by Zhou Enlai, prevailed. And after the four modernizations, China was set on the path, particularly by Deng Xiaoping, whose statement encapsulated the overturning of ideology over economics theory. He said, I don't give a damn whether the cat is red, black or white, as long as it can catch mice. So that is the pragmatic policy that was followed by the Chinese leaders. Whether it is a black cat or a white cat or a cat of undescribable color is of very little consequence. It must do its main job, and that is to catch mice. So that was the thinking which led to the emergence of market economics in China. And that is where we can learn from them and we can understand. In economics, there are two concepts that nobody can ever overturn. One is the notion of comparative advantage. Unless a country recognizes and builds on its comparative advantage, it has no chance in the market economy. The number two factor, which is very clear in the Chinese example, is the notion of cost of production. Inbuilt in the notion of comparative advantage is the notion of cost of production. So unless countries can ensure that we are competitive through the use of our comparative advantage to create, to ensure cost of production which can help us compete, then I don't think there is very much future for that country, even if there can be a lot of verbiage. There's a lot of verbiage to cover up because the consequences of wrong policies are not felt immediately. It takes a little time. So it's very important for us to know that these eternal verities have to be considered. Of course, Sir Ivor Jennings said that the only eternal verities in the world are the question papers of the University of Ceylon, because every year they ask the same questions. So apart from those eternal verities, there are the economic eternal verities, and those are the things that we have to learn from China. So what is the comparative advantage that Chinese politicians, thinkers, think tanks also paid attention to? First, a realistic assessment of their potential. Number one, the large population, which had, thanks to the commitment of Mao Zedong and the early leaders, had now come out of famine, come out of poverty, and was in a state where they could contribute to economic growth, particularly industrial. So that was the first step, that investment, the social investment, was converted into a marketable workforce. And that workforce was comparable to any workforce in the world in their dedication, in their discipline, in their hard work. So that any investor at that time, we are now talking of 3 decades ago, 4 decades ago, looked on the Chinese workforce as a tremendous plus in investment. Can we do that in Sri Lanka today? That's a question that BCIS must ask. Then, number two, they made a very clear decision. We must have foreign investment. We cannot have a domestic surplus which can be invested in infrastructure growth. The Chinese infrastructure growth at that stage was dependent on the, what you would call the extra, or the extra income that was generated by the state enterprises. They were costed in such a way that there was a surplus, and the surplus was appropriated by the state for use in infrastructure development and not frittered away like in Sri Lanka, in giving various perks to their workers and no contribution whatsoever to the general treasury. In fact, it was the reverse process. The general treasury was financing these fellows, these incompetent SOEs. So what has happened in Sri Lanka is the exact opposite of what happened in China, even in the worst time, when the state-owned enterprises were giving their surplus to the state so that they could invest in infrastructure. In Sri Lanka, it has always been the other side, where the hard-earned tax money has to be handed over to these state-owned enterprises, and of late we have created the worst of such state-owned enterprises called Sri Lankan Airlines, which is a bottomless pit. It owes $1 billion US. Every flight employs 360 workers. So you can imagine that if you look at one of the worst managed state enterprises in the whole history of the world economy, I think Sri Lankan Airlines will be in the top 10. So we have to do something about it. It's a bottomless pit. Even at the worst of times in China it was not. But that type of surplus coming from their domestic institutions, corporations, catering to a very small market of people with surplus incomes was not feasible. So they took a decision, we must have foreign investment. Not foreign investment in small, piddling little accounts, but massive foreign investment. So that today the Chinese economy is driven largely, at least today, I'll discuss the current changes a little later, largely by foreign investment. And it is one of the ironies of modern times, unknown to the Sri Lankan socialists, that the Chinese economy was propelled by American funds. Today China has 14 trillion US in US treasury bonds. And the advice given by the Chinese president to the US president was, please look after the dollar. Don't fool around with the dollar, because of that 14 trillion belongs to us. If China decides to take all its savings from the United States will collapse in 24 hours. Within 24 hours, United States will collapse. There was a time in Margaret Thatcher's time when the pound collapsed, you will remember, when there was the need for IMF bailout. Margaret Thatcher had to make a secret visit to Brunei to plead with the Sultan of Brunei, please don't take your pounds out of the back of it. That is international economics today. So I can't understand these local communists and various fellows saying that, we don't want investment, we don't want American involvement, we don't want Indian involvement. I would strongly recommend that they should have a visit to the psychiatrist, because they are unaware of what is happening in this country. They are unaware of what is happening in the world. The greatest success story of modern times is the rise of China as an economic superpower. Nobody can gainsay that. Some can say that it's also paralleled by the Indian economy. Maybe so, maybe not. But nobody can deny that our generation, I would say our old age, is characterized largely by the rise of China as a great economic superpower. So that is fueled by foreign investment. Of course the party had regulatory authorities. The party also ensured that there was no discipline, there was strong discipline, and the workers were guaranteed, the government guaranteed certain major rights of the workers, but it also guaranteed industrial peace. So these are the hard-boiled decision-making that takes place in economics and politics. We are playing a difficult game. We have to play hardball. You can't just write an article to the newspapers and think that the world will be set right. There are so many decisions that have to be made, and China made all those strong decisions. I will come later, there is the aftermath of that, consequences of that. But the result was that China became not only the leading growth center in Asia, but the main motor of global growth when the industrial world was declining. In fact, very many do not know that the two are interrelated. The decline of the advanced industrial countries is linked to the super growth of China. Because what has happened? The American consumer finds it much cheaper to buy his car, to buy his food, buy his contaminated milk, everything from China. So that every day factories were closing in the United States. Everybody, I think, should know that Barack Obama's victory, the very first time, was due to his victory in Ohio. Ohio was the swing state. And Ohio was the only state in which the government had invested funds during the downturn to prevent the closing down of factories. Those are the internal mechanisms, the internal dynamics of economic growth which have to be studied seriously. Cannot be settled by just slogans or arguments or even seminars. So this is the hardball economics that China played. Now that period of growth is over. That period of 3 years of 10% GDP growth is a phenomenon unknown to man. That type of growth on that scale with the largest population in the world, I think is a great tribute to humankind. That the humankind can produce leaders of the type in China, could guide, I think, 1/6 of the world's population. I'm not sure the exact, 1/8 or 1/6 of the population, within a space of 3 decades, to making it a global economic superpower. I think it's a great tribute to humankind. And now what has happened? I don't want to go into all the details, but the latest situation is that that type of market, especially the external market, is no longer available. Another decade of that level of Chinese growth would have meant the collapse of the American economy. And Americans now, very strangely, these archetypical exponents of free market are bringing all sorts of rules to prevent free market in migration, free market in exchange of capital, free market in ideas. All that is being stopped. Today, America is becoming one of the most protectionist countries in the world. Can you imagine Trump representing a country which was complaining bitterly about the Berlin Wall? Ambassador Kasichet, you were there when it crumbled, wasn't it? Complaining bitterly, making a big propaganda show of the Berlin Wall. Those days we were very lucky. I was director of information. When 1 week I get an invitation from West Berlin, I could be dead sure that within 2 weeks I get another invitation to East Berlin. So this was the game, the Cold War game that was going on. Not anymore. Today Trump is suggesting building a wall all along the Mexican border. And unlike the poor East Germans, he is suggesting that the Mexicans should pay for the wall. That will keep Mexicans from coming into America. So this is the type of lunacy that we are confronted with. So be that as it may, protectionism, whatever people may say and whatever professors may write, has made a big comeback because of the expansion of China and the sheer fear, no other word, sheer funk of the American economy that it will be overwhelmed. So there are all sorts of tariff regulations, all sorts of regional arrangements. Now there's the Pacific Treaty Organization. They are going to have the trade relationship. All that, why? To contain the Chinese expansion, of course followed by smaller Vietnam expansion, Indian expansion and all that. So in that situation, with the depression of oil prices and the depression of the demand, particularly from Chinese who are led into the trap of depending entirely on an external market, now they are having a problem. But they have a way out of that problem by reducing growth but looking more inwards, because China, unlike us, has a large domestic market. And the implications of the Shenzhen model, and I'll tell you an anecdote which some of you know.